Hello once again, and as usual, you can call me Lily. This is the final video of my series of painting with watercolor or watercolor basics in Clipstudio. This is the last video, and we're going to take everything that we've learned from the first two and apply it to painting an actual painting. And the last two, we've learned watercolor basics and tips on painting skin with watercolor. Now, in this video, I am taking a drawing that I did a long time ago, I believe a few months ago, and I am just going to paint it. Now, there's no color. The tone is from a watercolor, and I set it to black with low opacity, and that's how I got the tones. It's just white and black, and of course the tone of the background is showing through. Now we're going to hide all this when we start on our painting. The tools that I used were the G pen, the real G pen, and the real pencil, which are built into Clipstudio itself. Now, as I said, we're going to hide everything, and we're just going to leave it to its basic line work. No textures, nothing. So we start out with a very limited palette, and I'm going to use the first two. They kind of look like a brownish purple color for her skin. And I take the wet wash brush first and I lay it down onto her skin. Now the background's already toned to a sort of light yellow, and that works in my favor. So I start to mark where the midtones and the shadows will be. My light source is coming from two places. The main one from the top, and the secondary from is facing her. Now I keep all that in mind because, as I said before, you start light to dark, and it's hard with watercolor to go back and add highlights unless you use another tool. So essentially I have the midtones down and I'm coming in with the shadows. And at this point, I do not use the wet wash to do the shadows. I start using the watercolor marker. And I just use the watercolor marker from this point to paint the rest of her skin. When it comes to the animals and the flowers, I do not use the watercolor marker. I use the wet wash paint exclusively to paint the flowers and the animals. Notice my palette is very limited, and that is because with watercolor, it's very important to have a limited palette. I know when you're painting anything, you have to have a limited palette, but watercolor more, can't talk today, even more so because it muddies really easily because it blends so well. You can muddy the colors quickly if the palette is not limited. So I'm just refining the skin. And again, going from light to dark, we are not doing anything that we didn't do in the previous tutorials, of course. And it's worth noting that I do not take away the lines in this painting. I keep them, so I'm not going to worry about the edges because the lines are already there to give me that refined edges, and that's the look I want. Now for her skin, I wanted more of an ethereal look for her skin, so I'm only using two colors, of course, and I will not be adding any like blush or warmth to her skin at all. Also, I did use the triangle blender on her skin, but I did not use the blender anywhere else in this piece except for a few details on flowers here and there, such as the orchid, I believe. And as you can see, I started with the wet wash and I applied it lightly, and then again I'm refining the shadows of the flower, and I'm just going in to add more details. I started with an opacity rather low with the flowers, unlike I did with the skin when it came to the wet wash, to originally lay down the colors, and I gradually increased the opacity over time to make it more saturated and to make the shadows more intense, because for the flowers I limited myself to about 1 or 2 colors for each. So we are approaching the end of the video, and I would like to add that um, from this point I use the watercolor marker to add highlights. Now I know what I said before, you can't really use watercolor to add highlights, and that's true with most watercolor markers in my experience and the wet wash brushes, unless you want the highlight to be really faint. But in this case I found out that this watercolor marker could, with a lot of layering, add highlights, especially if you want the highlights to be really faint and light. And this is what I did. I took the yellow and I made it extremely light to add some soft highlights to her skin, or to boost up the highlights that were already there. Now I also took the real gel pen, or the real G pen, and I took the blue and I made it really light so it would appear white, and I added some highlights to the edge, and I took the triangle blender and I'm blending them. This is to show you that it is possible to add some highlights with watercolor, of course depending on the brush itself. With wet wash brushes, it's not likely, or the highlight will be very faint, but of course it just depends. So I'm taking the real G pen and I'm adding a bark texture, and I'm going to erase it or line it up with a knee eraser in the shadows to let it show through the midtones. And that's kind of just what I did. And of course at the end I'm going to turn on back the layers that I did draw from the past, and I'm going to give the paper texture, which is the oil paint paper that should be built in Clipstudio. And voila, here we go. Thank you so much for joining me in this series, and I hope you found these tips to be helpful, and ciao. Thank you again.